Hello, happy St. George Day. I'm delighted to share some of my enthusiasms with you. And in this event, I'll be talking about 6 Swiss authors who were masters of the short form. In my experience, except for the most well-known Swiss writers like Max Frisch and Friedrich Dürrenmatt, Swiss writers tend to get lumped into the language group that they write in. And I have 5 Swiss writers who wrote in German and one who wrote in French, who writes in French, who I'm going to present to you and read a bit from today, just to give you a sense of the immense variety of writing in Switzerland. And this is only in the genre of the short form. The first writer I'd like to talk to you about, Robert Walser, is considered one of the major forefathers of contemporary Swiss literature. He's influenced an enormous number of his countrymen and countrywomen, but also his influence extends throughout the world. He was born in 1878 into a German-speaking family in Biel. He left school at 14 and led a wandering, precarious existence while writing poems, novels, and the many little prose pieces that became his hallmark. He celebrated the insignificant with sharp wryness and raised modesty almost to a combat sport. W.G. Sebald called him a clairvoyant of the small, and indeed his genre of choice was a short form hybrid of story and essay. Walser stopped publishing in 1933 and spent the last 20 years of his life in a sanatorium where, he said, quote, "I am not here to write, but to be mad," end quote. For all the outward simplicity of his life, his texts reveal an understanding of, imadrama that is quite gripping. Susan Bernofsky's biography of Walser will be out next year, and I, for one, am looking forward to reading it. The first short text I'll read of Robert Walser is called A Kind of Story, and this one was translated by Christopher Middleton, and you can find it in the New York Review book collection of his stories. A Kind of Story. I am a kind of artisan novelist, a writer of novellas. I certainly am not. If I am well disposed, that's to say feeling good, I tailor, cobble, weld, plane, knock, hammer, or nail together lines, the contents of which people understand at once. If you liked, you could call me a writer who goes to work with a lathe. My writing is wallpapering. 1 or 2 kindly people venture to think of me as a poet, which indulgence and manners allow me to concede. My prose pieces are, to my mind, nothing more nor less than parts of a long, plotless, realistic story. For me, the sketches I produce now and then are shortish or longish chapters of a novel. The novel I am constantly writing is always the same one, and it might be described as a variously sliced up or torn apart book of myself. And his wry self-awareness is really beautifully and delicately on display in many of his texts, but one that displays that particularly well is from 1925. It's called Parisian Newspapers, and it is translated by Tom Whalen and Carol Gehrig, also in the same collection. Parisian Newspapers. Since I have been reading the Parisian papers, from which the scent of power emanates, I have become so refined that I do not return greetings. And what's more, this amazes me not at all. With Le Temps in my hand, I appear very elegant to myself. Furthermore, I will no longer even glance at righteous people. To me, the Parisian papers are a substitute for the theater. Also, not even the finest restaurant will I honor with my feet, so subtle have I become. Gulps of beer no longer pass my lips. My ear approves only the melodiousness of the French language. Once I adored a lady, a true lady. Today I find her most clumsy, since Le Figaro spoiled me. Did Le Matin not drive me half mad? While my colleagues write themselves sick in this modern time of crisis, I grow exuberant through my papers. A trip which I intended to take to Paris, I consider completed. I become acquainted with France's capital by way of reading. It is pleasant to be in good company. The papers of conquerors make the best society. German language products get no more blessing from me. I have forgotten how to speak German. I wonder if there's any harm in that. And this is a nice segue to my second writer, Ludwig Hohl, who wrote in German, but spent most of his life in Geneva, in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, because he had a very conflicted relationship with his homeland, especially its Germanic side. Hohl was a great admirer of Walser, but while Walser was a master of feline irony, Hohl wielded it more like an 800-pound gorilla. Hohl's own preferred short form was a hybrid of story, parable, philosophical reflection, ethical exhortation. Born into a pastor's family in the small town of Netztal in the canton of Glarus, Hohl was eventually thrown out of the gymnasium because of his rebellious disposition and his frequent talk of women, cigarettes, and Nietzsche. Hohl was essentially an autodidact, and his relationship with his native land was always fraught. After falling out with his parents, he spent his early 20s in self-imposed exile in Paris and Vienna, then lived in The Hague from 31 to 37. And it was there, between 1934 and 36, in a state of extreme spiritual isolation, that he composed the bulk of his masterpiece, The Notes. This work is a meticulously ordered compendium of notes. Over 1,000 observations, anecdotes, reflections, recollections, many essays and quotations are bound together under his philosophical conceit of Arbeit, or work, as the unrelenting and wholehearted use of one's creative forces. Although Hohl published some poems, essays on literature, stories, and novellas, much of his life was dedicated to revising and reordering the notes and composing a kind of sequel, which he called From the Invading Margins, or the Afternoons. He spent most of the last 2 decades of his life on the edge of poverty in a windowless basement room, strung with a web of clotheslines on which he hung and continuously rearranged his notes and afternotes, along with newspaper articles and photographs. So I'll read a small selection of the notes, which I've translated for Yale University Press, and that should be out next year. Here is the German version. From section 2, which is titled On the Accessible and the Inaccessible. Note 108. It's a simple matter of beginning somewhere, not at the beginning, because there is no beginning. And from section 7, entitled Autobiographical Varia. 1. He chalked this or that failure up to love. Some became suspicious and asked around. Love said she knew nothing about it. 5. One night, a man dreamt of 2 things: a very pretty young woman who snuggled up against him, and a disturbing encounter with the police who confused him with a burglar and threatened to lock him in jail. The 2 dreams had the scorching clarity that keeps them vivid throughout the day. The man roamed far and wide all day, convinced he would find the young woman. The day passed, and the chill of disappointment enveloped him. The woman had not come. Neither had misfortune, of course, but he hadn't expected it to. 6. It took him a very long time to go into the water, and yet, the moment he was in, he began shouting obscenities at those still on shore. 32. In a cafe, I thought I recognized a fisherman I had not seen for months. I approached him. It was not he. A quarter of an hour later, I entered a different cafe. The sole guest was the fisherman. I can't draw any conclusion from it, but I've had this experience at least 10 times. And that brings us to Adelheide Duvanel. She was another avid admirer of Robert Walser, and she also struggled with mental illness, undergoing electroshock and insulin shock therapy in periods of hospitalization. Her stories reflect that anguish, the inner psychological anguish that she wrestled with all her life. A selection of her stories, translated by Patricia Stanley, is available from University Press of America. The eerie coincidence is that she died much like Robert Walser. She went out for a walk one night, whereas Walser died of a heart attack on Christmas Day in 1956 while he was out on a walk. Adelheide Duvanel died of exposure on a mountain walk, but that was in July. It was very cold in 1996, so 40 years after Walser. The suspicion is, of course, that she committed suicide because she had taken a fair number of sleeping pills before setting out. This story, called The Yawn, also reflects the frustration of being unable to communicate with others the way one might want to. So this is called The Yawn. The tree was a golden monstrance that stood stiffly on the hill. The other trees bowed to it, trembling a little at the same time, as if to soft music. The man, who always took people at their word, lived on the hill. His wife, his friends and acquaintances asked him, "Do you have to take everything literally?" "Yes," he said then. "Yes," he said then. "Yes, I take people at their word." Words were so significant for him that he hardly ever used one. Before he spoke a word, sometimes he wrote it down and regarded it for a long time. There were people who sought his company, for they felt comfortable in his silence. His wife often yawned and never put her hand up to her mouth. This upset him. What was she trying to tell him? Was she bored with him? One day he said to her, "Look at the trees, like a monstrance. Look at the tree, like a monstrance. It stands on the hill, its feet buried in the earth. It cannot move from that spot, but it is not unhappy. It loves every single cloud that flies above it and every bird that rests on it." "I am not a tree," his wife said. The window frames of the house cut square pieces out of the blue sky. His wife did not stop yawning. The man sketched her wide open mouth and sat for a long time looking at the image. He became convinced that his wife's mouth resembled a zero. He shivered, although the sun was burning in the sky. He left the house on the hill and hiked down into the valley, where he found accommodations in an empty garage. There he painted black holes on little bits of cloth, which he tried to sell to tourists. Friends regarded his new existence as a mystery. They supplied him with food and brought him wine. When his wife finally visited him in the garage, he screamed, "My mother always yawned when I talked about myself when I was a child." Adelheide Duvanel was also a prolific visual artist and did many paintings and pastels and colored pencil drawings. My next writer, Klaus Merz, is mostly known as a poet. He's one of the most prominent, prolific, and versatile Swiss writers writing today. Born in Aarau in 1945, he worked as a secondary school teacher and adult education teacher before devoting himself full-time to writing. He's written more than 24 books of poetry, long and short fiction, essays and commentary, along with screenplays for television and film, and stage and radio plays. Just a few years ago, Seagull Books published a collection of 3 novellas by Klaus Merz, which I translated, called Stigmata of Bliss. Merz has been called a master of concise, condensed sentences, and his fiction, like his style, can seem deceptively simple. Yet the more closely one reads his works, the more their complexity and richness emerge. His novellas are tightly constructed. Not a single sentence or image is unnecessary, and his poetic language and striking images bring depth and resonance to his spare narratives. This density is even more striking in his short fiction, of which he's published 6 collections. In many of these, just as his spare and elegant sentences lure you into the small worlds of his characters, he pulls the rug out from under you as you read. I will read just one short text of his, if you're interested. The novellas share a number of those qualities, and also in translation in the Brooklyn Rail, there's a selection of his short texts that I translated, and the link is on the Centrality website. This story comes from the 1994 collection, At the Foot of the Camel, A Different Perspective. Shortly before nightfall, Binswanger's wife smoked a cigarette high up in her apple tree. Wrapped in a bathrobe, she stood on the ladder's top rung, looking to turn one last trick while her husband circled the village on his moped, delivering the evening paper after his shift at the factory. And we diligently beat up her 2 boys on their way home. "I am human too," Binswanger howled, as on every evening he had delayed his return home until the pubs closed. feet planted firmly, he stood in the dark, starkly lit kitchen and brandished his shotgun at his wife, between the table, the cupboard, and his wife. Every morning, she gave him back the magazine with its 6 rounds, setting it next to his coffee cup on the kitchen table. She also left the tape recorder playing, to spite him yet again with his ranting from the previous evening before he left for his next shift. That he would fill his mouth with water before shooting himself in the head is something we certainly never expected of him. The wonderful thing for me about Klaus Merz is how he captures the abysses of the human soul with a lightness of touch and when such evocative, stark imagery. Michel Layaz is my one Swiss author today who writes in French. I translated a novella in stories of his for Seagull books called My Mother's Tears. And Michel Aiyaa, writes mostly novellas, some short stories. He's written 6 works of fiction. And he writes with a subtle sense of humor and an unerring eye for human frailty and the lengths to which people will go to hide their flaws. He's also written movingly about the hidden tensions within families, the awkwardness of adolescence, and the drama of intimacy between friends and lovers. In My Mother's Tears, he takes objects that provide the center of 30 short chapters, and his focus is on this single talismanic object, a resonant episode from his childhood, in order to solve the mystery behind the flood of tears with which the narrator's strikingly beautiful, intelligent, and inscrutable mother greeted his birth. Like insects preserved in amber, these objects, an artificial orchid, a statue, a pair of green pumps, a fishing rod and reel, or a photograph of his mother taken minutes after his birth, are surrounded by an aura that permeates the narrator's life. And in between these short chapters, there's a monologue addressed to his lover as he tries to work out his own psychological burden and feelings towards his mother. I'll read one of the stories called The Windup Car. My brothers and I had a large collection of small metal cars, and none of us felt the need to claim ownership of this or that particular model on the grounds that we had chosen it specially or received it as a gift. The cars were passed from hand to hand without the slightest hitch. This fine spirit of sharing was put to the test when a model in a class of its own joined our fleet of cars. We each wanted to be the sole owner and driver, even though the notion of a driver suited this car even less than it did the others. Several distinctive features lent this automobile an aura of prestige that occasionally sparked insurrection at the heart of our group. It was much bigger and less true to life than the others, with its exceptionally high tires and a disproportionately large steering wheel. It was shinier and, most importantly, it was completely autonomous. In other words, the car had a mechanism underneath that you wound with a key and made the car run on its own for 2 or 3 minutes, an enormous length of time, we thought, which ended when the key suddenly stopped turning in the opposite direction to the one that activated or charged or fed the race car. No epic feat was impossible. The car would, for example, cover the long hallway with stunning speed, crash into the kitchen door, stubbornly try to knock over an armoire, and, to our whoops of encouragement, it would speed off again towards the dining room, repeatedly bumping into chair legs and lamp bases, and find one last open space before coming to a stop wherever its course had led. And so we could begin again, winding up the key and following a new journey in which all surrounding objects became part of the scenery. Our apartment was a universe. Just as it is impossible to predict the path a weighted ball will take when thrown hard, the wind-up car never followed the same path twice, and this pitted us against each other in a competition to be the one who launched it on the most extraordinary, the most insane course, the one we would still be talking about at bedtime, in the spirit of this logic of one-upmanship, in which we shied away from nothing and put the most muddled plans into action. When I saw my mother stretched out on the living room sofa, with her hair like a tragedienne's offering, I had a hunch her head might be an excellent starting point, an unusual pole position that would floor my brothers who worshipped this woman like a prophetess they had to remain on their guard against, and whose good graces they could never afford to lose. With the stealth of an assassin, I approached the sofa on all fours and placed the race car wound up tight on my mother's hair. She shot to her feet, but could not, despite her quick reaction, untangle the car's key as it dragged her hair, twisted, rolled, and sucked it deep inside the mechanism, leaving us no choice but to wait for the end, or for 2 minutes, that is, for an eternity. My mother didn't try to do anything. Her face wasn't strained or contorted. It was implacable. And her expression, which was the negation of all expression, did not alter until the car's motor finally choked. I can see my mother standing there, the car caught in her hair, glued to her head like a suction cup. My mother going to get a pair of scissors, handing them to me, and in a voice more cutting than the sharp object I now had held tight with trembling fingers, in a voice full of contempt that tramples all remorse. In such a voice, my mother says, "Cut." And I see my hand hovering uncertainly above her head, and the unavoidable necessity of having to cut her hair, very close to the scalp where the car had worked its massacre, where the white and pink color of the scalp is visible. And my mother, who will be left with this bald spot for several weeks, a hole she will never try to cover up, but will instead, displaying her wound, present me alternately as the executioner, the irresponsible one, or the backward child one couldn't possibly scold or truly be angry with. My final author for today is Judith Keller. If you look at the website, you'll see that I did an interview with Judith for St. Jordi, featuring her collection, The Questionable Ones. It has not yet appeared in English, but we're working on that. In the interview, she explains, or we talk about the source of the title and what it means and what her intentions are. So I will just describe her text and read a few for you and let you pursue your interest if you're inclined. Judith will be coming to New York next year for the festival Neue Literatur, New York City's only, well, the United States' only German language literary festival. So please keep an eye out for that. There are links on the St. Jordi website. Full of quirky humor and wry insight, Judith Keller's microfictions unravel the fabric of daily life. She delves into this aporia of language by taking idiomatic expressions literally, unpacking the multiple meanings of words, and confounding expectations. Her characters are hapless and far-fetched, trying to find their feet on shifting ground, and grateful for what hap they can find. In just a sentence or two, Keller unlocks metaphysical trapdoors. The book is organized around 7 Zurich tram stops, and at those tram stops and in between them, we see familiar yet absurd passers-by, fellow passengers on the train, on the tram, the unemployed, the overemployed, the innocent, the suspicious, young mothers, and confused elderly. It's a panoply of humanity. Xavier. Xavier always falls in love with women he doesn't like. He never notices this while he's in love, but he does see it afterwards. Anticipation. Muriel is one of those women others prefer to think back on than deal with directly in real time. Thus, everyone is grateful for the memories they will have of her, and so leave her with a certain sense of anticipation. Hope. You see him always holding out hope with a view of the lake. He holds it with lots of ducks so that it's heavy. If it were light, he couldn't bear it. But it only gives him heft when he can bear it. It's the only heft he can hope for. Max. One summer, Max felt the need to reinvent himself. He reinvented himself on a cruise ship. He reinvented himself exactly as he was before. But this time, Max knew that he was the one who'd invented him, and everyone agreed that Max had finally found himself. I hope that I've given you a sense of the strands that run through the thematic strands, the stylistic strands, the imagery, the preoccupations that run through all of these authors who deal with these preoccupations in very different ways. In closing, I'll read one last text by Judith Keller. The announcement. One evening, Mrs. Finsterwald prepared a special dinner. She has an announcement. One evening, Mrs. Finsterwald prepares a special dinner. She has an announcement to make to her family. I've got an announcement to make, she says, first looking down at her plate, then into her daughter's eyes, then into her son's eyes, and finally into the eyes of her husband. We'll have to find a solution. I'm sure we can find one. She gives each of them a long look, her husband, her son, her daughter. Then she gets up from the table. I knew we were a strong family. She leaves the dining room to give her long suppressed emotion free rein. She'd like to jump for joy. She has forgotten that she hasn't yet made her announcement. She'll remember soon. That's not a sight we'd like to see. Quick, let's leave. Thank you.